But I wanted to read the introduction to Nassau first, and then I want to read your introduction. The purpose of Nassau is to train organizations, individuals, and groups to take positive action, to strive for a better world through classes, hands-on experiences, projects and activities, and to encourage the participants to strengthen them to take action to control their destiny. This school came about by, several people around Huntsville who kind of got tired of seeing organizations get started, fizzle out, nothing good. And so we thought that maybe we need to do something to educate people to organize. And we have just a mountain of people who have, experience to come in and do that. And so we started it. We've had 2 classes so far. One of them is, I taught a class in building and sustaining organizations and coalitions, which dealt a lot with the old I belong to the Rainbow Coalition, and also Dexter Strong, who's on here with us. He taught a class called The Politics of Jesus.
Ooh.
Which I think you'd really like.
I'm sure I would.
And so that was a very excellent class, and we had a good turnout for both. And so we're getting into our year now, and I'm sure you've already seen our classes and everything, and we're going to be starting others. But I wanted to introduce you. Liz Theoharis is the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and the director of the Kairos Center for Religious Rights and Social Justice at the Union Theological Seminary in New York. So it's good to see you. And, I thought, we'd just talk, and if you can tell us a little bit about your profession and what you've done in New York and what you're doing with the Poor People's Campaign, that would be great.
Sure, I'm happy to start there and look forward to just a conversation. So I was raised in a really socially justice oriented family, both out of necessity, the kinds of issues my family was facing, and out of kind of theology and politics, the ideas of, what Jesus requires of us, to do justice and love kindness. And I met up with the National Union of the Homeless in Philadelphia when I was about 18 years old, and got pulled into a movement to end poverty led by the poor ever since. I helped to found something called the Kairos Center, which is at Union Theological Seminary, and have been doing that work for about 15 years now, looking at what does it take to kind of raise up generations of community and religious leaders who are dedicated to building a social justice movement led by those most impacted by injustice. When I was a part of the Homeless Union and the Welfare Rights Union, when I was organizing amongst poor and homeless people all across the country, we would look to history to learn about other moments when poor people had organized and come together across, lines that divide us. And one of the examples we learned about was the 1967 and 1968 Poor People's Campaign. And this kind of last campaign that Dr. King was a part of, but also, many of the welfare rights leaders that have been kind of my political mentors were a part of that campaign, had really helped to shape what that campaign should be. And so for about 25 years of my life, I've been very aware of other efforts of poor people to organize across race and geography, in particular in this country. And at the 35th anniversary of the Poor People's Campaign, Poor and homeless families did this kind of march from Marks, Mississippi to Washington, D.C. at the 40th anniversary. I brought about 50 different students and activists down to Memphis and to Mississippi and different places, and we talked about what it would look like to reignite. And then at the 45th anniversary of the Poor People's Campaign is when we decided to form the Kairos Center. But again, we had a program at Union Seminary for about 10 years before that. And we said we wanted to form the Kairos Center so that we would take very seriously, as we approached the 50th anniversary of the Poor People's Campaign, the relaunching, reigniting of a campaign for today. So much of my work for literally decades has been, what does it take to build up a big and strong and powerful enough movement led by those that are most impacted across these lines that divide us, especially crossing, race and geography, in the ways that they've been used to divide us throughout, U.S. history. And so then about 3 years ago, we started to kind of officially form and launch the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And we're organized in about 45 states. There's coordinating committees made up of impacted folks, poor people that are organizing, made up of clergy and other faith leaders, made up of activists and, kind of all people of goodwill and conscience. And in 2018, at the 50th anniversary of the 68 campaign, we launched and carried out the largest and most expansive wave of nonviolent civil disobedience in the 21st century. And then we've kind of kept on building and organizing. So we're now getting ready for a big mass Poor People's Assembly and a moral march on Washington. It's going to be an online event on June 20th. But really, it's just following along the lines of kind of shifting the narrative in this country about who is poor, why are we poor, stopping these ways of dividing us as poor people, and trying to really push back against this lie of scarcity, that we can't do any better, that we don't have the resources as a nation or a world to do anything about this. And then we're trying to build power, build organization, build unity amongst, the 140 million people who are poor and low income in this country. And so that's much of the work that I do, is really, helping to kind of weave together a network and a series of committees and organizations. There's about 100 organizations that are on board with this, representing millions of people. There's about 16 national faith denominations and bodies across faith tradition that are a part. But what was really at the core and the center of the work is a leadership and organization of poor people, of homeless people, of people without health care, of people who are working, what they're now calling essential jobs, but getting expendable wages, right? And so, and folks that are confronting state violence, confronting the kind of, deeply embedded white supremacy of this nation, folks that are seeing their voting rights taken away, over the last decade, and trying to see the connection between these kind of what we call interlocking injustices of racism and poverty, ecological devastation, militarism, and this distorted narrative. And so that's a little bit, or that's a little lot of it about the work that we're doing.
Yeah, you're doing some fantastic work. I mean, just wonderful. I brings back some memories of 67, 68 that I was at Resurrection City.
Yeah.
I lived there for 2 weeks in the mud and gore and all that stuff. And we had a group of mostly Southern whites that came, migrants from Chicago that went out there. And so it's always been close to my heart, this Poor People's Campaign. And on our, just on our trip out there, we stopped to get food, some box lunches, and we were poisoned. The food
Oh my
Somebody
gosh.
poisoned the food. And yeah, by the time we got to Washington, D.C., we were pretty sick, and some of us had to be hospitalized.
Oh
Um,
my.
Others were, I had to stay at an apartment of people for 2 weeks just to get well. But, there were people watching us at that time that didn't want, this poor people's campaign. And they would go to extremes of just literally poisoning people,
Wow.
But it was quite an experience. We took a group out, and that was certainly an education for me. I think that's one of the pivotal moments for me when I decided that what I wanted to do was to work, in the movement, and had the pleasure of, not so much with Dr. King, but with Abernathy. Working with Ralph Abernathy, who later on I became a Vista volunteer because I'm just saying this how this ties together. Because I was conscientious objector to the Vietnam War, and they made me do an alternative service, and I joined Vista, which is AmeriCorps now, I think. And Ralph Abernathy's brother was my counselor. So you couldn't really get away with it. But when we talk about the poor, and one of the things that I've noticed over the years. Now, it was different back in the 60s when we were talking about, and I'm sure you may have run into this problem too. People would admit that they were poor. Poor and poor and poor. I can't get any credit. I don't have anything. So pretty much of what's happening now, the difference is people will say, well, I don't know if I'm really poor or not. I got my flat screen, I got my phone, I got these kinds of things. But I believe that was part of a plan, by the capitalist system to try to appease, for one thing, the poor, and also to make them a part of their group. So they would think that they're really not poor. But then again, they don't have the services that, and Colleen Wessel McCoy, very well, in her dissertation, she points out the disparities of what the poor, the difference is, and how you can't judge the poor anymore by the car they drive or where they live, but you judge them by the disparities that they have, because they don't have. They still, the poor still doesn't have a good shot at education, or the healthcare system that they are prevented from getting. And you can almost sometimes figure out where the poor are by zip codes, because there's certain zip codes that people live in, and if you do the research in it, you'll see that a lot of those zip codes have been gerrymandered, and so they actually know, how to exclude, the poor people from the system, and it's a known fact that, there's a higher rate of infant mortality within those communities. And this is white and black and brown. I mean, it's not just one, but, the higher portion is in the black community. I mean, from the research that I've been doing. And that, pregnant women, just because of the stress that they're under and the discrimination, have babies that are less weight than anyone that doesn't. So there's a lot of things that, the Poor People's campaigns bring into light that I believe, we need to get that information out there, But our problem here in Huntsville is we've had a hard time doing that. We've tried to organize, the Poor People's campaign, but somehow it just didn't work, So maybe with you being here, working with us, we can try to get a little bit more dynamite into that, and try to get something going. But anyway, I didn't mean to get off on that, but I do. But I also, would you like to take some questions from some of our people?
I would love to. Yeah.
All right. Who's got a question for? Must be 100 of them out there. Hey guys.
Well, I was just, hi, Zach's been leading this Mark's discussion group that we've been going on for weeks down here now, and I've a couple things that Liz was talking about the myth of scarcity, and you were talking about how it is that people think they're not poor because they have a flat screen TV and a smartphone and all that kind of stuff. But the Marxist analysis of economics really explains how all that happens, and it's been really an astonishing, eye-opening experience for me. I'm really sorry that I didn't do this 50 years ago, but it's amazing how the capitalist system is set up so that what we mostly think of as profit, which in Marxist terminology is the surplus value that's generated within the system of production. Whenever there's any kind of productivity gain and that surplus value increases, all that goes to the capitalist, unless they maybe give the worker a small fraction of it, which they can do to keep things on an even keel, maybe. So gradually, what the people that have got the flat screen TVs and the smartphones don't realize is that is a material improvement in their situation, but it is only a small fraction of the improvement that occurred in the overall situation, which all went to the top of the food chain. The system is voracious and absolutely amazingly efficient at basically taking money out of poor people's pockets and putting it in rich people's pockets is what it boils down to.
That's exactly.
I was having a conversation with some folks with the United Church of Christ this afternoon, and someone was saying something that I think kind of resonates with this, which is that it's not that the system is broken, it's working the way it was intended, right? Where,
Right.
it's not just an oversight, it's not just a mistake, that trillions of dollars have gone to the wealthiest people and corporations, as really the majority, 85% of people really have seen very little out of the trillions of dollars they said they didn't have until this pandemic hit, but then they found it. And it went to McDonald's. It went to, increasing the wealth of the richest billionaires by $500 billion, right? When families that were 40% of families that were making $40,000 or less have lost a job in this, where there's an increase of homelessness by 45%, right? And so it's not that the system is broken. Is that it's working the way it's intended, which is to benefit those that are with wealth and with power. And yet there is a power of people coming together and changing that and organizing, a weak link to this system, an Achilles heel to the system, as Dr. King talked about, right, in 68, was the poor and dispossessed of this nation live in a cruelly unjust society. They must organize a revolution. The only real revolutionary, people say, is those who have little or nothing to lose. If they can be helped to take action together, they will do so with a freedom and a power that will be a new and unsettling force in our complacent national life. And then he continues, right? He says, so starting in the new year, we'll be bringing thousands of people to Washington to practice and learn nonviolence action skills. And so, but I think every day about this idea that what the weak point of a system where a very few control the power and wealth over the very many is to unite and organize those who have little or even nothing to lose to then unsettle this complacent national life. And so I think about that a lot when we live in this broken but unbroken system.
Yeah, and it's like you said, it's designed that way. Even I'm thinking back even with cash for clunkers, when they had the cars that people could trade in their cars and get a new car. Well, obviously those cars are old now. And those used cars are more expensive than they used to be. So it had an effect of raising the prices of used cars where people can't afford it in a lot of ways. And so, and they also said, we'll give you credit. Well, you're still in debt, so yeah, I like to know, you mentioned January or something about Washington.
Well, that was just the quote from Dr. King
okay.
before he was,
Yeah.
So he was making this in the, what becomes published in the Trumpet of Conscience. He was doing a lecture series called Nonviolence and Social Change, and it was on the Canadian broadcast systems. And so he did a series of these radio conversations in November and December. So this one was in December that I was just quoting from. And then he was basically saying, so starting the new year, we're going to start, calling people to build the resurrection city that you were at, but that obviously happens after his assassination. But the Poor People's Campaign today is, taking action, in June, but then also, planning lots of really creative and kind of power building work throughout the fall and then surely into the new year. And we're still trying to figure out, in terms of, actions at state capitals, actions in local communities, but then also, the Mass Poor People's Assembly and Moral March on Washington is now virtual or digital. But we do intend to also go to Washington, D.C. in the near future as well.
Yeah. How do you feel about people getting training in self-defense or weaponry? That's happening a lot around the country, and I don't know if that runs counter to, the Poor People's Campaign.
So the Poor People's Campaign, a National Call for Moral Revival, we have a set of principles, and one of them is nonviolence. I think that's for a long history of nonviolent resistance, and also, so as to be able to kind of bring more and more people in and to kind of build the organizing power to be able to really transform society. Now, there's been a lot of conversation about violence in the last couple of weeks. And I really think we do need to, raise a question about is violence against property really the same as the intense violence that is taking place when people are killed either at the hands of the police or killed by the lack of the expansion of Medicaid, or killed by the 250,000 people who die every year in this country, the richest country in the world, because of poverty, right? And I think about Coretta Scott King, shortly after Dr. King was assassinated, someone said to her, what do you think about the violence of, this violent person killing your husband? And she's like, well, yes, that was violence, but, starving a child is violence. Ghetto housing is violence. Unequal schools is violence. And apathy towards, this type of injustice is also violence. And so, I mean, I believe that we need a broad and wide and deep social movement. When I look at this country's history and what has been able to, eliminate U.S. chattel slavery, what has been able to win the right of women to vote and participate in a democracy, what has been able to, undo Jim Crow, even when we have, new versions of, uh, white supremacy, constantly reemerging and emerging in different forms and in similar forms. But still, as people have been able to struggle and have been able to progress, it really takes a broad movement, but one that has those who are most directly impacted, in the lead. And so, the Poor People's Campaign is trying to help build and inspire and amplify such a movement.
Yeah.
But we also know we need many flowers to bloom.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's great. Does anybody have questions? There's Dexter.
And I promise I'll be concise. I moved back to Huntsville in 2018 to run a congressional campaign. I'm born and raised in Huntsville, Alabama. In Atlanta's a very different organizing space than Huntsville, Alabama. My primary, my education is theological. And for the last 5 years, I've been involved in electoral politics. Now as the communications director for the state party, which is a job that I never thought I'd be a comm strategist for Democrats ever. It's weird. The question I have though is, since moving back in 2018, I've been engaged in trying to challenge particular theological frameworks which allow Christians to look past the most abused and those in the most vulnerable positions. I was going to send an email via hi to you. We're doing a project called Solidarity Sunday right now. So June 21st, we're asking all the churches in Alabama to preach specifically against systemic racism and to take a solidarity pledge, to take concrete action and to get trained by organizations who do this work. The problem that we're running into, and we've made lots of calls, and I guess the wisdom I'm looking for is, in your experience, how do you break barriers between communities that they're engaged in the rhetoric of justice, but really don't want any part of the work? They certainly don't want the voices of those who are outside their theological community and marginalized voices leading conversation. What we're experiencing here is that, the usual suspects, the churches that at least trend more progressively, are all on board and they're agreeing to get the training. But the churches with the members who most desperately need to hear these types of messages and who need training on how to reframe how they understand the world, those are the churches that are bucking. How do you go about in your work? What are strategies and tactics that you've taken to help particular evangelical or conservative congregations transform the way they see themselves situated in the fight against structural inequality in its various forms?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a lot there, and I'm really excited to have the conversation about how do we move religious institutions, and how do we actually impact a kind of theology and definition of what are real moral values, and engage in that, in the movement building work we're doing. I mean, again, if we look at history, like significant moments in history have all kind of engaged in a battle for the Bible, right? You had slaveholders, creating a slave Bible that did not have the Exodus, that did not have the prophets, took out all of the references of Jesus to letting the oppressed go free and freeing the captive. But you also had, from, Harriet Moses Tubman to, Frederick Douglass. I mean, and that wasn't a cute title. That wasn't like a little nickname. That was, that was a conception. That was a theological battle, where folks were saying, you're trying to leave this part of Christianity out, but it's the founding story of many faith traditions is one of God freeing people out of bondage. And so, and again, if you just kind of look throughout history, there's this kind of battle that takes place. And that, we often have this saying that, like, you're really trying to address a problem. So, in the case of 21st century, United States, if you're really trying to overcome racism and end poverty, right? If you're really trying to kind of save the earth and the militarization of our communities and this war economy, then you have to be able to end that in people's minds. You have to have people believe that it's possible, not in some idealistic way, not in some like, once we convince everyone, then it will happen. We're all activists here, so I know that that's not the case. But if people fundamentally believe that this is as good as it gets, and that God wills the kind of inequality that exists, or that politics have nothing to do with religion, when the Bible is a collection of stories of poor people coming together across all the lines that divide and organizing with God on their side and bringing forth, like, huge social movement and dislocation, right? And so, but I think then to like take seriously this kind of battle for the Bible and this battle of theologies, and to see, for the past 25 years, as I've been doing grassroots organizing work, there really isn't a week that goes by in my life when somebody doesn't quote this quote from the Bible, the poor will be with you always, to justify inaction in the face of poverty and say, well, this is just the way it is. Some things will never change, right? And that's from folks that are deeply religious. That's from folks that are involved in a movement. And that's from poor people who have, won significant victories. That's from, self-declared atheists, But this notion that poverty is inevitable and willed on some level by God, and the only time we'll get out of it is, there'll be pie in the sky when we die, kind of idea, that you have to engage in a battle over that, and when I go to that passage, and, I've spent a lot of time on it, I've written a book about it, in fact, it's saying exactly the opposite, but there's something about doing that work. And there are concrete ways to get faith communities involved in the struggle, starting with, getting folks to engage in deep theological and biblical reflection about what really people are called to do. And even if it's just a small number of the usual suspects who are out there talking about these issues, doing so in visible and vocal ways, and not running away from the faith that undergirds those prophetic leaders. Because I think for a long time, progressive faith leaders, have been so embarrassed, so disgusted by what is defined as kind of, morality, that a lot of times you don't hear enough of some of the really powerful work and theology that is out there. And so what I have found is that if those prophetic ministers who are out there doing progressive, organizing work, just stick with it. People come, like people are hungry. People are seeing that we need a revival of moral values, a revolution of moral values in our land, and that the real moral issues of our day are healthcare and living wages and these types of issues. And so, I think, I've seen congregations really move and change when there are organizing campaigns in their communities that they can connect with. So if workers are organizing in a meatpacking plant, if there's a union organizing drive that's taking place, if farm workers are coming together, if minimum wage workers are trying to organize, if the homeless are taking action, and then come into those churches, speak from some of those pulpits or some of the announcement places and talk about, will you come out and be supportive? Will you come out? And I've seen, real shifts happen amongst churches, including churches that were not engaged before. And I've also seen that when we really get our congregations to study biblical text, not, for in their fullness, in the fullness of conversation with what's happening in the world and in conversation with the historical and political context of Jesus's day and the prophets' days, that I see many people actually be kind of awakened into struggle. And so, the Poor People's Campaign has a whole kind of set of religious resources. You can go to the Kairos Center or the Poor People's Campaign website. We have a lot of, litanies and like we've on Sunday evenings, a bunch of us have been doing a Freedom Church of the Poor online worship service. And, folks that do not come out of a kind of liberatory theology have been joining and really just starting to think about, what are the religious issues of our day and how do they connect with social justice? But again, not just the choir singing to the choir, but spreading it a little bit farther.
Thank you.
Okay. Catherine?
Well, and when I'm listening to that too, like I think to myself as well that I have friends who are political activists and they run around saying, why don't people get it? Why don't people get it? And I'm like, because somebody, you get it because somebody invested like some enormous amount of time in your political education, right? Like you didn't just emerge somehow fully formed. Somebody invested a lot of energy in your political education to get you to be able to see things differently than what keeps being fed to you in this kind of nauseating fashion, right? So I guess that's my thing too, a little bit in listening to that conversation is the idea that just it's like a learned skill. You know what I mean? Like I said to my mother when I was really little at some point, because she was always activist about something, like, where is she? She's always in a meeting. And and I said,
too.
Why do you go to do all fighting about all this stuff and you lose all the time? Because kids aren't easy, right?
No.
Like, holy crap. And she looks at me and she goes, well, I don't lose all the time. But what I took out of that too was the idea that like all you need is a win. You don't need to win every time, but you need to win. Like you have got to have the experience of winning something. I don't give a shit if it's an argument, or whatever it is, it's big or small, you have got to have some experience of winning. And I feel like there's some people that end up being very inherently kind of reactionary and conservative because they feel like they never win anything. They have no sense of having collectively won anything ever. So I guess I wonder if you can come up with ways of making opportunities for people in some way that will kind of motivate them to take another step. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. I feel like the first point that you were kind of making, they're all connected, but about, really investing in leadership development and political education. I just think that is really important. That one of my kind of political mentors, Willie Baptist, who is an organizer with the Homeless Union, often says, you can't lead people that don't agree with you, right? And so So if you're trying to move people to get involved in the causes, to get involved in the movement, there has to be education front and center, and not just not just like saying believe, agree with me, that, but just the opening up of, when Hai was talking about the realities of poverty, when we're talking about, how how these issues manifest. We have a failing education system. We have a media that is controlled by the same corporations that have all the wealth and power, and so we can't kind of wait for those systems in society to like bring about a social consciousness of the people. And so we have to engage in deep organizing, but also, popular and political education. And then I think when it comes to this question of like, we often say a leader has at least 4 qualities, and that the education or organizing work you're doing have to be about building up those 4 qualities. And one is kind of consciousness, like one is a knowledge base about the issues and history and what it takes to win. The second is capability, right? The skills, the wherewithal to like actually, whether it's organize a protest or a rally, or whether it's to put together a political education system, session. You can't just know things. You have to be able to know how to do things, right? The third is connection, right? You can't do this in isolation. One or 2 or 5 people protesting in a corner is really important, and doing that over and over and over again. And you have to build, all of the connections, all of the networks that each of us, can have. But then the fourth quality of leadership is commitment. And again, commitment isn't bought and sold. Commitment isn't, it's how do you touch people's values, including this notion of like, do I believe that we can actually win? Do I believe that things can actually change? And some of that is about knowing, statistics and numbers and empirical data, like the fact that we spend more, that the US, paid more for one fighter jet to Boeing than it would take to expand healthcare in 14 states, right? So there's a use to knowing that, right? So that it isn't just scarcity, we just can't do it. But touching people's values is also about like, do I believe that human beings matter? Do I, and so many people do if you actually, get to this question of on the level of commitment. And so to me, what's really important is for sure that kind of coming together and that kind of power building that happens when people do have those wins. I think, also a value system that insists that we fight until we win. And again, we have examples. We have it can be done because it is being done. I think what we've seen even in the last couple of weeks as this beautiful protest movement is emerging across the country is that people's kind of desires and aspirations and hope that this society could change are coming out, right? The response, I think, at first to the first couple of months of this pandemic, and of course there's not one response, but has been that people have seen that our institutions are failing us, but also we've been so ingrained in the society to not believe that it's going to be organized around our needs. We're so, been so beaten down in this society that we might know that that's totally messed up, but, we assume that we have to just let states open back up because the only people that are going to take care of us are ourselves, right? Because of 30, 40 years of neoliberal capitalism where all entitlements, but all kind of social programs have been taken away. But but to me, what you see in this beautiful protest movement that's emerging is actually a hopefulness. I mean, it's obviously a mourning, it's a grieving, it's a pushing back, it's a being incredibly angry righteously for the deep and injustice and for these institutions that are failing us. But it's also calling into being that it doesn't have to be this way, and that we have a power, and that these institutions indeed have failed us. The state has indeed, lynched another person funded by the state, lynched many more people, and we're gonna say enough is enough. And so to me, even being able to see those as victories, just people coming out and protesting, not, is admitting that things aren't okay and we got to do something about it. Now, you can't stop there, but you surely have to start there. You don't start with the good ideas. You don't start with the, everything being figured out and beautiful and perfect. You start with the fact that, like, my back is against the wall and all I can do is push. And right now you have thousands of people across this country pushing. And so then the question is, do we have the political education? Do we have the type of organizations of those that are impacted by issues? And do we have the kinds of demands that are bold and visionary and not just, one-time demands, that we can actually build a powerful movement that can actually change things from the bottom up?
Yeah, and one of the things I've noticed about the difference between the 60s and movement and today's movement is that, well, back then you had a draft that held a lot of the young white people together. Well, there's not a draft anymore. And these are really, that I can see being a real true commitment that these kids are making. I mean, you got all these white kids coming up that's supporting the the Black Lives Matter, and they don't have to do that. There's no, I don't know what the glue is holding them together, other than they really want to see a change in society. They really want people to be equal, and I think there's something that's working on people's consciousness now that hasn't worked for a long, long time. We talked about racism back in the 60s, during the Black Power movement. But what I can see now is something that's much stronger. And it's a beautiful thing. I just hope, it keeps building, but it's like you say, we got to have that political education out there somewhere, to educate, and our motto is educate to organize. And I'm just hoping that there's more organizations that can do that, but yeah, we'll just keep trying. But anybody else got a question?
Yeah, I think what you just said, Liz, leads right into what I wanted to ask you. I know the Poor People's Campaign has been planning this March on Washington for some time, and now it's become a virtual march. And in the meantime, out there in the real world, there's all these people out on the streets who are basically, I think, their concerns track with all the moral concerns of the Poor People's Campaign. How are we going to bring them into the fold? How are we going to collaborate with all these people who are just running wild out on the streets?
Well, I mean, I think what I've been so encouraged by when I get reports from the different Poor People's Campaign, state committees, is, how many different organizations and individuals and activists and actions that people, have been seeing and being a part of and seeding, for some time now. And so I was really excited when, to see some of the videos and hear some of the chants and slogans and songs that were coming out of Minneapolis, and then to see some of the Poor People's Campaign kind of, we call theomusicologists, some of the song leaders from our work, out there actually writing and singing the songs of the nonviolent protesters, and hearing so many of we the Poor People's Campaign did this action around taking almost 9 minutes of silence on Monday, and thousands and thousands and thousands of people all across the country that have been, some folks that are still social distancing and haven't been out in the streets organizing, but have been really supporting and calling for and encouraging and amplifying a movement about equality and about the dignity of Black lives, and calling forth for living wages and policy changes and all of this. But then also folks that have been organizing in the streets and in the protests, again, found this to be a really powerful action as well. And so, I mean, I think what we've been excited about is just that these are times that call for people to, be out there and organizing. And, when folks gather for June 20th online for this online gathering, we'll be able to see how Kansas farmers and folks in the Mississippi Delta and, protesters in Brooklyn are all kind of in this together and organizing together, and seeing the connections between militarized and police communities, and the lack of healthcare, and the lack of living wage jobs, and how our society and government has utterly failed people in this pandemic, and then calling for, again, not just a couple of small incremental reforms, but instead like broad sweeping policy changes that impact everything from, water rights to indigenous rights to demilitarizing of our communities. And so I just, to me, I'm just excited when I hear about the powerful rent strikes and protests, and that so many leaders that are a part of the campaign and a part of other campaigns are doing in this moment, because I just think the time has come for people to say, okay, enough is enough.
Absolutely. Okay, well, it's an hour or so. We don't want to keep you any longer. Is there any final question that somebody has that's really burning that they need to ask here? Thank you so much, Liz, for joining us. It's really been an honor and a pleasure, having you on, and we certainly hope that you'll come back, sometime, and we can do some more organizing, and we'll certainly keep you, attuned to what we're doing here, and don't hesitate to call on us when you need us too.
That's awesome.
Okay, and it's all solidarity.
Forever.
We do it through solidarity. Okay.
For sure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good evening, everybody.
Yeah, thanks.
Good night, and thank you.
Be well. Be
Thank you,
well.
Doctor.
Thank you.